Hello and welcome to the show Beyond the Journal, where we will discuss social media, digital education, and current controversies in cancer and medicine. I'm Dr. Jack West, Associate Clinical Professor in Medical Oncology at the City of Hope Cancer Center in the Los Angeles area. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Charu Aggarwal, Leslie M. Heisler, Associate Professor of Lung Cancer Excellence at the University of Pennsylvania's Abramson Cancer Center in Philadelphia. Hi, Charu.
Hi, Jack. And today we have on the show with us two very esteemed colleagues of ours who will talk to us about online education and conferences in the age of the pandemic. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jamie von Roenn, who's the Vice President of Education, Science, and Professional Development at ASCO. Welcome, Jamie. And joining Jamie is Chris Merlan, who's the Chief Digital Officer and Executive Vice President at ASCO. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
So I'd like to start off with our first question. Starting with AACR, almost all conferences have had to pivot to online platforms, and this obviously was an unprecedented Herculean effort. Could you take us behind the scenes and how this all played out in March, April of 2020?
Well, so about 7 weeks before the ASCO annual meeting, we realized that there was no way to safely host a large medical conference, a large conference of any kind. But we were very committed to presenting the science and making it available to the medical community. So this was really a joint effort. It was across departments at ASCO. And Chris can really speak to the Herculean effort from the point of view of getting this up and running from a digital point of view. From an education point of view, we had the speakers. The science was selected remotely this year. That is, we had essentially a WebEx conference instead of the program committee meeting. But we did all the things we usually did. People presented their abstracts and made their proposals for which abstracts should get into the plenary. And the decisions were made, as they always are, with the same level of review and the same ongoing discussion throughout the selection period. And then we needed to train staff and volunteers how to put their programs and presentations together for a digital presentation. Chris, will you talk a little bit about the technology aspect?
Sure. I think one of the main decision points we had to make was how to provide the best consumption or vehicle for the content or channel. And I think what we really decided on early on was pre-recorded sessions, because we did think that the dynamic nature of having everyone sort of logging in and being live for a Q&A or those sorts of things would be a little bit too difficult to pull off in that short period of time. So once we made that decision that we were just going to pre-record, we just locked in a couple of partners that we had been using, because we record all the sessions at the annual meeting. So we basically just took that same format and path and just consolidated the heck out of it. So once we had all the presenters record their materials, we did a lot of Q&A. We did a lot of buffering and testing to make sure that no matter how many people came, we would be able to sort of hold up under the demand. And that was sort of the biggest thing that we could do. And it was, we had to go find chat features and other things that we just were not prepared to have at all. So it was a little bit random and sort of chaotic to get those last bits and pieces around the experience. But, it was actually pretty energizing, to be completely honest.
No doubt.
Change does foster energy and innovation. So I think we learned a tremendous amount and are still learning as we're moving forward with the next series of meetings.
Obviously, this was amazing in part because it was all so on the fly. I mean, it was in real time. Can you speak to how people reacted to it, and how understanding everyone was? Were there people who were disappointed or frustrated to not have it be live, or was just about everyone accommodating that this was the way it had to be and miraculous, and how you could put it all together in short order? What were people's attitudes?
So I think the truth is it's both. Me and everybody else was disappointed that we weren't all together, and yet there wasn't anybody who complained. Really, we only were short a handful of presentations if you take Ed and Science together. So really, the medical community as a whole came through beautifully.
Yeah, I think the only sort of challenge, the bigger challenges we had around the disappointment side were you had some people who were trying to basically use that technology for the first time of doing a virtual meeting, and we were buffering certain things to make sure that once the feed started, it wouldn't sort of break up. So there would be people who would go to the session, would start, it would buffer for 10 seconds. And they were like, it's not working. I don't have audio. It's right. So you have that anxiety. So the anxiety on day one was pretty significant in the chat rooms. Like, it's not working. I have to and then basically by Sunday, there was nothing. Like, everybody oh, this is how we do it. There's no more issues. And there's no more, we had very few calls into the help desk. So it was nice. To Jamie's point earlier, the audience learned in 48 hours, oh, this is how I'm going to digest the content at a virtual meeting. And it was pretty impressive to see them sort of move in that direction so quickly.
I mean, it's amazing. I think all of you should be really applauded for really a phenomenal meeting. And, many of us obviously miss going to Chicago and, miss the convention center. We know where Hall E is and exactly how many minutes it takes us to go from, Hall D to, S2 for the next session. So it was obviously, growing pains. And I think looking at the schedule was a little bit different because, we didn't quite have those blocks of getting data. It wasn't like, the lung cancer session, non-small cell metastatic will be at 4 p.m., whereas the non-metastatic will be at 1 p.m. So what kind of considerations went into creating and delivering content? Because, it did come to us all at once on Friday. Did you think about putting it out there in maybe bits and pieces, or take us behind the scenes in terms of, putting it all out there?
So what we thought about was, how do people use the content? And if people want to go view abstracts, that's something we all do sort of in the time between things, going to the poster hall, reading posters at lunchtime, in the morning, odd times. But to hear the orals, and especially to hear discussions about the orals, you have to have time to see all of that. And so that was why we released all of that, the oral sessions at once, so that people could see them and then learn from that as they listened to more material. The other thing that was very different, as you probably noticed, is the highlights of the day. That in the real meeting, that is the live meeting, as we've thought of it in the past as the real meeting, we only have so many tracks that we do highlights for. But in this setting, we were able to do them for every track, which was actually a huge advantage. So we could think about the consumption of content and how people integrate it. And it's sort of surprising to me. What we heard from people is they actually learned better in this setting because there weren't the distractions, which I found surprising, honestly.
I was just going to say the other thing that we tried to do is not put too much content out there, like live streaming at once, right? We really wanted to be managed around that, so that, because in many cases people were watching the live stream and they were perusing other content at the same time. So we've got lots of feedback on people with 3 monitors up showing everything and running through a whole bunch of different stuff at once. So people who wanted to multitask really could, but we didn't want to have everything streaming at once because that would be a little, that would be too much.
I also found it interesting to be able to play back recorded content at faster than normal speed. So if you're if your ADD was really in overdrive, you could watch things at 1.5 or greater speed and feel like you were really flying there. But can you talk about the decision to split the content, the scientific program and the educational one, and how that was received? It obviously changes the tempo, the feel of the meeting, not having everyone converge for one event, the traditional weekend or 4 or 5 day period, but it changes the schedule. And is that something that you were happy with at the end of the day, and the feedback you got? And where do you see that evolving if we are in a situation in future years where there may be a hybrid approach or even a virtual one, and we have the luxury of time to plan for it in the future?
So there were a couple of considerations. One was we knew we had people's attention for the weekend of the meeting that's usual because people block it off on their calendar. But this is a year when we also thought that people had so many competing priorities that they didn't have Friday to Tuesday to sit with us and watch videos. Also, getting all of the content ready for delivery that quickly when it would be both education and science seemed like more than we might be able to pull off in such a short time. And so we made the decision to split it, feeling that the science was the urgent stuff to get out, and the education was something most people would view on demand as time went on. We did survey people afterward to get a feel for what people want, and they really do prefer it all together, even if it means sitting for 5 days. So if we are virtual in 21, it will all be together.
Okay.
I think that resonates with many physicians and colleagues that I've spoken with, that I think, the demands on weekends have been very challenging during the pandemic. So to block out 2 weekends sometimes can be, yeah. So maybe during the week is better, actually.
So we polled that one too.
You did? And what did you find?
Most people actually still like it on that weekend. And I think what we've uncovered, and I think Jamie, correct me if I'm off, but most people block those 5 days or 4 days on their calendar way in advance. Right. And that's like so any migration that we do off of that period of time, like when we did the portion, there was far fewer people attending than we had for the annual meeting because it was just hard to clear up, to your point, on the weekend. They had already booked that weekend for something else. Right. So there was not that dedicated time to have. So the numbers were far lower than we would have expected. And I think the other bit of feedback was outside of the context of the science, the educational content on its own was probably not enough to be as far away as we had it. So we really wanted it to be paired up next to the science content as it came out.
So if we're virtual in 21, they'll be integrated like they always have been.
So it's really hard to, envision a convergence of tens or thousands of people in 21, especially now that we are at the verge of our quote unquote third peak. What do you envision ASCO 21, or for that matter, ASCO 22 to look like?
So if there is by some remarkable feat a vaccine distributed in early 21, then we'll have what's being called a hybrid meeting. So we'll have both a virtual and a live meeting. My guess is that won't happen, and we'll have a virtual meeting that will be the usual 5 days and will be both education and science as we've done in the past. But there are real benefits to the virtual meeting. And so subsequent years and subsequent meetings, not just the annual meeting, but the GI meeting, the GU meeting, et cetera, I think we'll have both. So some of the advantages are things like leveling the playing field for people who don't have the resources to attend, either time or money, especially internationally and more junior people. We had many, many more junior people at this meeting and more international from countries that have never been represented at the meeting. And that's because they didn't have to pay to travel. Because even non-members that were international, although the rates were lower, they did have a fee, unlike members. So I think you're going to see more virtual experiences around meetings as well. So for example, the highlights of every track, we may not ever have that at the live meeting, but I can see putting that together and making it available to people virtually after every meeting. I think those are advantages to doing both.
Did you did you look at patterns of how the content was consumed and how that differed from the live event? Because my sense is, when you go online shopping or just about anything, it's much more of a winner take all or a winner take most focus of attention. And my sense was that was also kind of the way that that things went in the virtual meeting, that there was a lot of attention paid to things on social media. And so there was a great convergence on the bigger plenary session and oral session content. And it may have been harder for people to get their attention to the poster session, which has always been one that people wander through. You talk with all your colleagues you bump into, and you sit and chat with the people in front of the posters who worked on them. So I think there's definite big wins in the virtual program, but also some things that are difficult to replicate. So can you add some thoughts to what you've seen, and maybe also if there's a way to address that in future years?
So I'm going to let Chris go ahead. Yeah. I was going to say that was, and then I'll go.
That was mine. So the statistics for what we had was within the 3 days of the meeting, we had almost 800,000 video views. So video on demand streams of the content was about 650,000. So it was, and then the live streaming was about 108,000 views over the 3 days. 184 or 185,000 roughly people watching or looking at the poster content, about 330,000 looking at the slides, and about almost 1 million people looking at abstracts. So if you think about the types of the amount of consumption, and the other interesting piece we saw was it wasn't just the 3 days of the meeting. The tail typically for the annual meeting content is a massive burst and then basically nothing. And what we saw was a very slow and long sort of a winding tail of I think 10x of what our normal content consumption would be for the annual meeting content. Oh, wow. So yeah, the numbers were off the charts, and we were delighted with that. So to Jamie's point around how do we take that interest, but also pair it with the new things we want to try on the experiences side, like how do we have live Q&A? How do we do focus sessions for people who may want to debate a certain topic or a certain bit of research? So how do we mimic as much of the live experience that we might be able to in a virtual? And that's to your point earlier, Jack, you can use the virtual format much easier and quicker to actually test those things out. So we've been working on the meetings that we have had virtually to try bits and pieces out of technology or new experiences to see what's working, what's not working. And then we're going to sort of, the annual meeting will be the master class of what of those things actually work really well. And then that's what we'll put together for the virtual part of AM21.
So even this month, we tried live Q&A for the Quality Care Symposium, and it worked extremely well. And we'll be trying that for both the GI and GU meetings, and we'll also try poster walks and discussion sessions there that people can actually talk to each other and share their understanding and questions regarding posters. So we're going to keep experimenting to make it more and more like the live experience, but we'll never replicate it. That I think we'll always have a reason to want to be together.
Sure.
It's who the community is.
Fair enough. I think it's so important for us to, see each other. I think participation in a live meeting will be even more, in higher numbers whenever we are able to do it safely. So, your points are well taken about, incorporating some kind of virtual format into our meetings. So when my kids are in school, some children are opting to learn virtually while some children are actually in the classroom. So the teacher is having to deliver content in real time to the kids in the classroom. And then, she's interacting with the cameras and making sure that the Zooming kids are also synchronously learning. Do you envision such a platform for such a large meeting that, perhaps the speaker is on stage and is speaking to a room full of attendees, but is also being broadcast at the same time to provide real life, like synchronous delivery of content?
So we won't be able to do that for every session, obviously, but we imagine that some of the bigger, higher profile sessions will be streamed live, and the same technology will be used to ask and answer questions online and virtually. Obviously, the people in the room will have an advantage. They can go up to a microphone and get their question asked next, which you can't do online. You just get voted up, and if you're lucky, your question gets taken. But the goal is to make those two experiences as seamless as possible. I'm sure Chris has comments on that.
Well, our vision is really, as we've been talking, is that you could be remote on Friday and show up to Chicago on Saturday and Sunday, and really it should not be jarring at all. The virtual experience on Friday should be as close to what we can replicate for the Saturday and Sunday experience. So to exactly that point, as you're watching the content or sort of interacting with a Q&A or something else, that it's not going to feel much different than when you show up, other than you're going to be in person. And to Jamie's point, it's probably easier to get up in front of the microphone. The other main piece that we're trying to do around sort of the virtual component is it's requiring a different set of skills. Like, one of the things we were talking about for AM21 is we were talking about a producer. And producer is a very loaded word because it could be any type of producer. And I was like, well, are you talking about a digital producer, somebody who's producing content? They're like, no. Like a TV news broadcast producer, somebody who hosts like Monday Night Football, where you're switching camera lenses, you're going from the virtual session's done, now pan over to I was like, holy cow, it's literally you're putting on a virtual TV program for 5 days. And that's really sort of like, that's the sort of, it's a whole skill set that we don't even have right now, but that's what we need to do it the way we want to do it. So it's unique and it's fun, but I didn't think we'd be hiring TV producers.
But I can even see that there would be potentially a need for the play-by-play person who's relaying the content, and then the color commentator who's talking about what does it all mean and adding some, stirring the pot a bit, which I like to do. But, so
right.
One of the other things that we miss in the live event is the ability to talk with other people. You're sitting next to them, or you're outside of, B1 and chatting about the oral presentation that you saw that morning or a half hour ago, and what does it all mean? We have social media, and Twitter has been rising in popularity at the live meeting over the last decade. And this year, it certainly played a critical role. And my question is, if that is almost the only way to interact and have that commentary on the side, how well does that work? And are there people who are missing out because they're not Twitter or other social media facile?
Yes, I think you're right. There are people missing out. And so we're trying to create virtual experiences that can pull people in who aren't Twitter fans or not social media users, period. So this year for the fellows, we did some special sessions virtually to talk with experts about the abstract. And we can envision doing special interest groups for the geriatric oncologists, or for some little niche group who has a lot of conversation and meetings within our meeting, but in this setting didn't really get to share their views of the posters from all the different diseases, for example. And I think we'll be doing more and more of that to try to address some of that missed opportunity. It's not the same as running into someone in the hallway. And I think those are the kind of things that we really can't recreate in the setting where you walk by someone, you sit down, have a cup of coffee, and talk about the plenary you were just in together.
And I think that was one of the lessons we've learned is the annual meeting, the in-person meeting really is a massive networking opportunity, a massive networking event. So virtually we can maybe mimic an engagement component for people who aren't there, where we can make it easier for them to engage in the discussions around the content. But the ability to create a networking platform, a la Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever, we won't be able to do that. And I think I think the joke was I've been here a little over a year, but we've tried it 5 times and it's failed every time. Because there's nothing that quite mimics that, exactly as you're saying. I run by old friend from school, in the hallway and say, "Oh, you were at the session, weren't you?" And then you just go off and have a conversation about it. But to mimic that, even with AI, is extremely difficult. I mean, we could try it later, but I think for right now, it's more focused on the engagement side because we can't mimic the networking.
It's interesting. We've had some focus groups that have been looking at what people want from the meetings. And what we've heard was something I didn't really recognize, but it resonates with me when I think about it, that when people are at the live meeting, they'll skip a session they wanted to go to if they run into someone they want to talk to, knowing they can pick it up later. That in the end, that interpersonal connection is more important than the science or the education at the meeting. Whereas in a virtual setting, people really settle in to do the learning and the hearing collecting the evidence that they're going to use in practice the next day. And that's the priority. And we can never mimic what pulls people away from the science live in the virtual setting.
Well, I was just going to say that I know other veterans of ASCO who say the sessions are the lower priority compared to all the convergence of the people who are there. You go there for the live meetings with people, some scheduled, but often the passing in the hallway and you pull over to the side and you haven't seen them since residency or fellowship. And it's not always just to talk about the session you just saw together, but just to catch up with each other. And obviously you're not going to do that in a virtual meeting. So of course there's give and take. Charu?
One of the things that we were also looking at on Twitter this year was that virtual engagement seemed to be actually higher than it's been previous years. So, the hashtag ASCO20, had much higher engagement than hashtag ASCO19. And is that a metric that you're tracking, an indicator of success in any way, shape, or form within ASCO?
So we keep track of it, but a measure like that isn't enough by itself, of course. It's the combination of all these things, because it may well be that next year, not 21, but in 22, if there's a reasonable number of people together, that the balance will be very different, even if the engagement is higher. There are different kinds of engagement, and I think when we're all virtual, all of the social media things are probably higher than when we're all together.
Yeah, the distraction is less, right? So the ability, once you're in an all digital experience, you're probably using your phone and because you see somebody come up on the screen, you may text them. I think the ability to just easily go there and not be distracted with it is pretty high. I think in the in-person, you're distracted by, as we were just talking about, the whole networking and interpersonal component. If somebody walks by, you're going to put your phone away and go walk around and have a conversation. So I think that was why we were, I think it was higher. But to your point, we do try to increase it all the time just to create more engagement and awareness and sort of more traction on the content itself. But, we were happy with the numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised, to Jamie's point, if as we have more in-person or more people in person, that the numbers go down a little bit.
Without wanting to get too much into how the sausage gets made, I think one reality is that exhibits and pharmaceutical company support are an important contributor to ASCO and the annual meeting. Obviously, the costs and the whole structure are fundamentally different if it is entirely virtual. but I imagine it's pretty difficult to get people in the same kind of numbers that sponsors would like to see into the exhibit halls, and you must be concerned about wanting to have a virtual component but not cannibalize too much the live meeting. And I would imagine that sponsors are hoping to see people meet up again in McCormick as much as possible. How much or how little does that factor in? Is that a real challenge in terms of the sustainability of the virtual component?
I don't think we have much fear about cannibalization. We really believe that the best way to deliver this education and make it available to the most people in the community is to provide both. That the live meeting will continue to attract people, and I think enough people that our supporters will be there. But the virtual meeting offers the opportunity to lots of people who otherwise wouldn't be able to participate at all. So we don't really plan to limit the number of virtual attendees or worry about that from a sponsorship point of view. The truth is, in spite of all of us being exceedingly nervous about whether or not 21 will happen, the exhibitors have signed up as if they're certain it will, and all the rest of us think it's pretty unlikely. I think just like the medical community will come back when it's safe, I think the exhibitors will too. I think it's a good meeting that has great science and has the support of the medical community, and so I don't think that's a big concern.
Yeah, what I would add is I do think I actually have never been to the in-person meeting. So for me, that was when I started, there was like, oh, you can't wait till you get to experience the annual meeting. And I was very happy with the digital version because that's sort of what I was brought in for. So I was very excited. So in talking to Mandy and Jamie, my comment was, well, when we come back with the in-person meeting, I think we had 42,000 or around 40,000 people at the virtual meeting. I said, so I'm looking at 45,000 in person and 45,000 people virtually. So I'm looking at almost doubling the capacity because that's really what we could do. But regarding the sponsors and exhibitors, one of the things we're trying to do at ASCO as much as we can is really take an outside-in customer approach. And we're trying to spend some time talking to the exhibitors and the pharmaceutical companies and say, what other things can we do that make it more attractive for you in a virtual setting? Again, if you ask them, they care about networking just as much as we do in the live meeting, right? So it's like, how do you mimic that? How do you create mutual experiences where they can get exposed to the right people that they're trying to get exposed to, or we find people who are attending who are looking for the right access to a clinical trial or something like along that line. How do we foster those bits of connection? Those are things that we can do, and we're sort of trying to research with them. But I think that everything on the digital side, the virtual side is more of an opportunity, I think, than it would be a cannibalization.
So I think we learned a lot about what different communities and stakeholders in the meeting want. So I think something that was underappreciated was how much people use the annual meeting to recruit faculty or partners. And so we heard from the fellows about this, not surprisingly, and ended up holding a career fair with interviews and connections later in the year for them. But there are so many different things happening there that are all about connection. We don't even know all of them, I suspect.
Right. And I agree that, one of the interesting, frustrating things to me is that there's so much going on at the meeting and so much that you would like to go on. It's like the found money dream. You can't do everything, and you want to be in 3 places at any given moment. And in a way, being able to have a live meeting and the virtual meeting in some way decompresses that. You no longer have to do one thing at one time because, you don't need to have conflicting things because you can do that, and it can spill over to other things. You can catch it later. And I think bolstering the virtual offerings will just make it, for many people, less stressful so that you can focus on certain aspects of it and get the rest, maybe not in that 3-4 day period that was a frenzied, race before.
I'm glad to hear you say that, since that's our plan.
Excellent.
So, an informal poll that we conducted amongst some women faculty found that maybe women more than men are experiencing meeting fatigue a little bit more, and specifically not, conference fatigue, but just, they're taking care of work during the week, and weekends are the only time that you can actually officially engage and, with your family and actually have a life outside of work. And then, some people feel like, oh, now I have to log in and look at this national or international meeting. I mean, it's great to be able to have that ability to watch on demand. But to Jack's point, some of these, late breaking abstracts, or, high profile clinical trials are being released at times that are often not conducive to consumption, right? So, for example, we just had the ESMO weekend, and some of the sessions were at 5 a.m. Eastern and 2 a.m. Pacific, right? It's just not possible to get them in real time, and sometimes people feel left behind. So, any specific solutions for this? I know there is no probably real solution. I think it'll have to be sort of a tailor-made approach for each his own or her own. But what is ASCO sort of thinking of as a solution for this to meet the demands of different subsets of people in different time zones, etc.?
So it's an impossible proposition when you think that oncology is very much a global community. So we can talk now in the evening, but in other places in the world, of course, it's the middle of the night or the morning, and we can't really fix that. What we are going to try when we have our next breakthrough meeting, which is our global meeting that will be in Japan next, is actually present things twice in the 24-hour period in opposite time zones to see if that will make a difference and help people. You still can't serve everybody's ideal times, but if we spread it out some or do it twice, it at least gives more people the opportunity of seeing it when they're awake anyway.
That's a great idea.
I was going to bring up the same point, Jamie, is that's one of those things that we're going to try, because it's, whether it's you're in Asia and trying to sort of rebroadcast it for the US or the domestic audience or vice versa, it's just trying to come up with something that, to your point, Charu, it makes it seem like it's happening in your time, right? And it's not something that you have to then think about and go after and consume later, and just another item on top of a long list of things you probably have to do on a weekend or even on a weekday.
Well, that's a great point. I think people will engage when it's delivered twice a day or something. I think many of us on the receiving end felt like, oh, we were missing out. All this data is getting released at like 5 a.m. and, it's sort of being behind the news cycle, right? Sort of when we learned of the diagnosis of a certain president of ours having COVID-19, and it was like, oh my God, where was I? And this was 5 a.m. EST, and it had already happened 3 hours ago. So it's sort of like being behind the news cycle a little bit. But I think there's no easy solution for this.
Right. I will say that being on the West Coast and having the news break at 2 a.m, I was okay sleeping through it. I didn't really agonize. But I'm interested in whether in some ways the new iteration of ASCO, if it has a live component and a virtual component, and maybe the live one is no longer 40,000 people, but is 15 or 20,000, who are coming more as academics for the investigational meetings along with the presentations, and more of the community docs maybe don't. Whether it might in some ways be a better experience for being a little smaller than it got in the last few years, because in the nearly 20 years I've been going, it went from a big meeting to an unfathomable meeting. And whether the question of 40,000 or more is too much of a good thing. I don't know if you or others at ASCO had ever felt that it could get too big to be ideal.
So we have debated, could it get too big? And so we worked at trying to make the meetings seem smaller when you're there. I would say that in 19, we did a better job of the way we placed sessions so that the bridge, for example, that you both know well, wasn't so packed, that the traffic patterns were better, even though it was the biggest meeting yet, not this year bigger, but the biggest live meeting yet. So we're still working on those things, and we've gotten better, I think, at building meetings within the meeting. So the pediatric group is always in the same area, so they're not in the hallways for between sessions. Things like that help the feel of the meeting, and more spaces for sitting at tables and chatting than we've had in the past. Just a lot more seating, period, so that people have places to go, so they're not standing in the hall in the same way. And the more things like that we can do, the size feels less, and that's what we care about. If the meeting gets a little smaller, but we still reach more people, that's fine.
Yeah.
The goal is to get the science shared and integrated into what people do. So that would be okay if we could keep attracting all these people who came virtually who have never been. That's an important plus. So I think we don't know what the balance is going to be 2, 3, 4 years from now. I don't know.
Right.
My guess is they'll both grow.
You're probably right.
Fingers crossed.
Well, this has been an amazing session with both of you chatting about, the current design of the annual meeting as well as what the future may look like. And congratulations to both of you as well as the entire staff at ASCO for pulling off a great ASCO annual meeting despite all of the challenges that we all faced. And we look forward to, more programming in the future, which I'm sure will be terrific. So thank you for taking time to talk to us.
Glad to. I think the whole oncology community deserves a vote, too, for credit that pulled this off, because they did a tremendous job learning new things and doing them well, as always.
I just want to say special thanks both for taking the time to look into the future with us, but also to acknowledge the potentially unsettling reality that this is going to change as we go. We had to deal with a lot of curveballs in March, April, May, tons. But even your last comments that we don't know what's going to happen in the coming years is the unsettling truth that we're going to keep learning from this and keep adapting.
Sort of who oncologists are, right?
Yeah. Excellent.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Thanks.
Thank you, too. Good evening.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.